people that we would all agree, at least in this room, are worthy of our respect. Right? And so how is it, right, that these four incredible figures across upwards of 80 years have found their way to want to actually be honorary members of the LWU? That's a good question, right? So that's what I'll do a little about in my introduction. So there's a long history of black radicalism and non-black radicalism in the LWU. In fact, as someone in the previous session noted, Harry Bridges was a white man, actually an Australian immigrant, who helped lead for many years and found the ILWU, and Local 10, the San Francisco Bay Area chapter, was his home local. Now, at the birth of the union, actually, there were very, very few African Americans in the ILWU, and very, very few African Americans in the Bay Area, for that matter. However, there's a long history going back to really the 30s and 40s of African Americans in Local 10 and other branches, including up in the Pacific Northwest, who were militant unionists, were by definition working class because of the nature of their work and backgrounds, were intellectuals, right, who read and thought and wrote and spoke deeply, and lived cosmopolitan lives, which is of course the case for port cities around the world, past and present. Many of these people, not all, or not even necessarily most, were anti-capitalists of one stripe or another. Some were formally affiliated with parties like the Communists, the Socialists, and others, but many were what we might consider independent leftists. Many of these African Americans, with their many, many white allies, especially in the Bay Area, fought racism in their unions, fought racism in their communities, fought racism in their country, and also fought racism and colonialism in Africa in particular, because of the reality that many of these black and white radicals in the ILWU identified with liberation struggles in the 1950s, 60s, 1970s, right? And that is, of course, why people like Robeson and King and Mandela and Davis wanted to sort of be connected to the ILWU, not the reverse, right? Although it's maybe mutually beneficial, right? So back in the 1930s, short history, the ILWU was born, right, out of the big strike of 1934, which shut down the west coast of every port up and down the coast from Southern California up into the Pacific Northwest. Also included other types of maritime workers, including those on ships, although itself and was closely associated with those along the shore. And although not, and that big strike was victorious after over 6 weeks, especially for the dock workers, who won all sorts of gains, wage raises, hours cuts, union recognition, union essentially control of the hiring hall, end of the shape-up, and more. Right? They also instituted a low man-out system in which they tried to equitably distribute the work, meaning that if workers showed up at the hall in order to report for work, those who had had the least amount of hours in that quarter of the year would get first jobs, although that has changed significantly in recent decades. The low man-out tradition and dispatch somewhat still remains. Now, in terms of racial politics, as other people have noted, including Clarence here today, you know, when the ILWU was born in the mid-1930s, there were very few African Americans who worked on the waterfront in San Francisco, very few. And as he also noted, many of those actually found their way to the waterfront by breaking the 1919 strike, which happened just after World War I, was a big defeat for the then Union. By the 1930s, Harry Bridges and other white radicals had actually learned some lessons and decided actually that it would be wise to sort of open up the Union to African Americans and other people of African descent. Famously, Harry Bridges is quoted as saying, if there were going to be two people working left on the waterfront, he wanted one of them to be black. Right? In the 1940s, a huge number of African Americans came into many Western cities due to the so-called Great Migration, right? Due to really labor demand from labor shortage in West Coast ports and industrial cities. And so really the 30s, still small, 40s, significant growth, maybe a quarter of Local 10 was African American. By the late 60s, majority black, the only black majority local actually in the Longshore Division of the LWU to this day. Now, it is easy to celebrate the Local 10. I'm often guilty as charged. But it is also well worth noting that actually other locals provided much more resistance to racial equality, including Local 8 in Portland, which was notorious for being white only for decades, and in the Port of LA, Long Beach, which actually had somewhat of a diverse membership, where there was in particular problems for African Americans for many decades. So just quickly about these four fabulous figures who have connected to the ILWU, and then who was connected to them within the ILWU. Well, Paul Robeson. I always tell my students about Paul Robeson. None of them have ever heard of Paul Robeson. It's amazing, right? The most important, well-known black person in the world in the 1930s, 40s is simply unknown, right? Like his legacy has been eliminated. That's actually the single best example of how red baiting worked, right? That we lost him. Right? I tell my students, if you combine, I don't know, Will Smith and Kanye West in terms of well-known black actor, well-known black singer into a single person and make them a left-wing radical, that's Paul Robeson, right? Like, he was good friends with people in the ILWU and the Marine Cooks and Stewards, which was red baited into death and subsumed, if you will, by the ILWU by the early 1950s, including his good friend Joe Johnson, who's pictured on the far right on the bottom picture, and then Rebels Caton, right, who of course started in Seattle before moving down to San Francisco, where he stayed with the ILWU in between the Cooks and Stewards. Now, in that era, that same era that Paul Robeson became an honorary member, 1944, 1943 of the ILWU, a young man from Arkansas named Cleophas Williams moved to the San Francisco Bay Area. Actually, he moved to Oakland, but he found work after starting on the shipyards, as many did. He found work on the waterfront in 1944, right? Cleophas Williams is a legend in Local 10 and somewhat up and down the coast. He passed away a few years ago, although his widow will be turning 100 next month, and there will be a big party at Local 10, and I'm not sure if everyone is invited, but at least some of the people in this room are going to be there. Unfortunately, not me. Local 10, led by people who were older than Cleophas Williams, people like Johnny Walker, Albert James, and others, actually pushed hard in the 40s and 50s in Local 10 to democratize it and integrate it, right? There was some resistance, in particular in, if you know your longshore stuff, well, the Quirks local, which was all white, right? And resisted really many black people until basically blacks in Local 10 forced 34 to open up its ranks in the early 60s with the support of Harry Bridges from the top, but also pushed from below from activists in Local 10. A lot of the in-between work was done by this man, Bill Chester, pictured on the bottom right, and in the center of the photograph shaking the hands of Martin Luther King, right, who himself was a migrant to the Bay Area from Texas and Missouri, but who really became the most well-known African-American first sort of most well-known African-American in the ILWU. He came out of Local 10, and thanks to subsequent black Local 10 activists, the Local 10 Hall is actually named in honor of Bill Chester today, right? There's a small plaque outside of their hall, right? Now, what Local 10 did with people like Chester, with people like Cleophas Williams, with people, many too numerous to name, is often called by academics as civil rights unionism, right? Where unions collaborate with other organizations to promote racial equality, not just inside of the labor movement, but in communities at large, often in conversation with and support of black churches. In particular, Bill Chester served as an important bridge between really the black churches in the Bay Area at that time, including San Francisco. Now I know we don't think of really, I know there's that movie, The Last Black Man in San Francisco, but really in the East Bay, right? But also in the city of San Francisco. I interviewed many elderly black dock workers who were homeowners in San Francisco when I was working on my book in the 20-teens. They did all sorts of cool things, but the thing I'd like to highlight is the San Francisco Housing Cooperative, which was the first privately developed interracial working class affordable housing in the city of San Francisco, which came online in 1963 and still exists as a housing cooperative in what then was Japantown, but because the Japanese had been pushed out, it was also called the East Fillmore, right? That St. Francis Housing Co-op is still in existence, although it's also changed in a variety of ways, but it still stands. And it was, again, the first multi-ethnic, multiracial, working class affordable housing that the ILWU financed, right? After urban redevelopment happened in the 50s, right? These are the sorts of reasons that a young man, he was only in his mid-30s, right, Martin Luther King Jr., came to San Francisco in 1967 to hang out with the ILWU, where he was made an honorary member of Local 10. He did so because, as we know, in the 50s, but increasingly in the 60s, saw that unions were a key ally. But also, as he said many times, it doesn't matter if you can afford a hamburger, if you can sit at the counter, if you can't afford the hamburger. Now, as a vegetarian, right, whatever, but I appreciate the sentiment, right, we need money, we don't just need equal rights on paper, right, economic power is necessary in order to make political power a reality, right, and so unions are that, and King understood that. He, of course, also was a democratic socialist. Third thing that the LW did, connected to soon to be Nelson Mandela, was fight for racial equality and to overcome racial apartheid in southern Africa. So there's a long history of anti-apartheid activism on the waterfronts in South African ports. My book on the Bear is also about Durban, which is the strongest, most important port in South Africa and in the sub-Saharan Africa. It was dock workers, led by this man named Vuyisile Mini, pictured on the right. One of the first persons executed by the state of South Africa in the early 1960s was a dock worker, a leader in ANC, a leader in MK, the armed struggle, and also a songwriter, and he was actually arguably killed because of his powerful songs. And he sang Walking to the Gallows famously in 1964 in Johannesburg. Just prior to his murder by the state of South Africa, dock workers in San Francisco, led by Bill Chester, were the first American union to refuse to work to protest apartheid in South Africa. And so when a ship landed, a Dutch ship, landed in the port of San Francisco with South African cargo aboard it, the men on the right, on the left in the background, in front of this small community picket, who the union knew was going to be placed, refused to cross this very small community picket in order to express solidarity with the struggle against apartheid. Right? It is worth noting that this morning, right, led by Arab American activists who threw up a community picket in Oakland, a ship was just refused to work, and the dock workers respected that picket, and weapons were not loaded aboard a U.S. ship for the war that Israel is perpetrating against Palestine. Right? So that wasn't a union action, although it was with coordination of and support of the union, but it was actually, again, the AROC. Thank you. That effort was led by Leo Robinson. Leo Robinson, pictured here, a second-generation longshoreman from Oakland, who was the leader of the Southern Africa Liberation Support Committee, whose most important action, or at least most consequential, was in 1984, where a Dutch ship came in, and for 10 days that ship didn't work as Local 10 members refused to basically work. In this case, they weren't crossing a community picket, they just refused to work. Right, and so there's actually two different tactics we're talking about here in terms of how dock workers might engage in refusing to work ships. Right, that is why Nelson Mandela, when he came to the U.S. on his first visit in 1990, he toured 10 places. I don't think he actually touched the city of San Francisco, but in Oakland Coliseum, before 50,000 people, he thanked the LW and Local 10 for their efforts. Last and not least, Angela Davis. Right? Now, Cleophas Williams, the first black president of Local 10, who became president, I believe, in 1968, or thereabouts, was president in the early 70s when Angela Davis was on the run, right? And Local 10's hall was the site, one of many, where Free Angela rallies occurred, but this poster is really the bomb, right? And sort of an example, right, of the sort of community activism and both in and outside of the labor movement. And of course, famously, after George Floyd was murdered, there was a shutdown of the Port of Oakland on Juneteenth, right, where Angela Davis spoke, among others. And the following year, she was inducted into the Local 10 honorary membership at Local 10's hall, where she said, if I couldn't be a professor, I would have wanted to be a longshoreman or a warehouse worker. I swear to you that I've said that before her. But you didn't know it because I'm not as famous as her. Right? But anyway, of course, there's a long history that takes us to the present, where we have labor internationalism and black internationalism, because dock workers are by definition international in their thinking. Ships are coming from overseas and vice versa, being sent overseas. And so labor internationalism, separate from black internationalism, but connected to black internationalism, really takes us to the present moment, where in recent years in cities like in ports in Italy, in ports in France, in ports in South Africa, where there's been protests and refusal to work Israeli-owned ships to protest its treatment and mistreatment of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. And so I thank you for your attention. I hope you now, if you didn't already, know why the LW is a fascinating union to appreciate. And so I look forward to hearing from several members to talk more about their efforts. Thank you.
Solidarity greetings all. I want to thank Peter for not stealing my thunder when he got to the part about Leo Robinson, because that's what I'm going to talk about today. I just wanted to say that I'm going to be doing a lot of reading from this text because I've been told that I have 15 minutes and I got about an hour's speech and 15 minutes to give it, so I'm going to stick to the script. But I had the opportunity of meeting Jack Hunter Odell. It was in Oakland, California in 2012. The occasion was a lecture sponsored by Congresswoman Barbara Lee and former Mayor Elliot Harris. It was a part of a series of civil rights lectures by veterans of the movement. I shall always remember our relatively brief but memorable and meaningful conversation that I had with him regarding ILWU and Local 10 specifically. He was very well acquainted with the history of our union, including our then recent shutdown of Wall Street on the waterfront, a coordinated West Coast port blockade in solidarity with the Occupy movement. When reckoning with the Black radical tradition inside of the ILWU, particularly Local 10, the person who comes to mind is Leo L. Robinson. A second-generation longshore worker, Robinson, in my opinion, is one of the more important rank-and-file leaders in the modern era. And I say modern era, meaning the 70s through the 90s. I say that because he was in the tradition of the founders of the ILWU. He was a leftist who was committed to rank-and-file democracy, as well as to the working class at home and abroad. Labor historian Peter Cole described Leo Robinson in an article following his passing in 2013 thusly, quote, legendary Local 10 activist Leo Robinson recently passed away. His intellect, commitment, passion, and savvy allowed him to help lead Local 10, though he served as an elected official only once. He loved this union and fought to improve the lives of all working people. But Robinson might be best known for leading the ILWU in the fight against racial oppression in South Africa. Born May 26, 1937 in Shreveport, Louisiana, to the proud parents of Arthur Robinson Jr. and Pearl Lee Young, his mother moved to the West Coast in 1942 to work in Moore's Shipyard in Oakland to prepare a place for his family. His father and 4 siblings moved to Oakland in 1943. Leo's dad also worked at Moore's Shipyard and was hired on the waterfront in 1944, the same year as my maternal grandfather found work on the docks during the great migration of African Americans to the Bay Area. Leo attended public schools in both Los Angeles and Oakland. George Washington Carver Junior High School's motto stuck with him all of his life. Leo said, quote, I'll never forget. I remember it as a man educated is easy to lead, but impossible to enslave. The quote is actually from Henry Peter Brougham, and it reads, education makes people easy to lead, but difficult to drive, easy to govern, but impossible to enslave. Brougham was a British statesman who played a prominent role in the passing of the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. Leo attended Oakland Technical High School and asked his mother for permission to join the Navy after completing the 11th grade. Leo said, I knew running around with my hoodlum friends that I wouldn't graduate from the 12th grade. He enlisted in the Navy in 1954 and spent 3 years, 11 months, 22 days, 11 hours, and 45 minutes in what he described as wasted time. He briefly worked in the ILWU Local 2 as a ship scaler. After working on an assembly line for General Motors, he became a longshore worker in 1963. When he came to the waterfront, he wasn't that political. His issues were all locals, and it was only later that it occurred to him that everything local was national and international. During the Vietnam War, a question by a young longshore worker changed his political outlook for life and led him into his activism. He said, I want to ask you a question, and you don't have to answer it now, but I want you to answer this question. Of what kind of a threat do the Vietnamese pose to you? He became politicized in the late 1960s, discussing the Vietnam War with fellow longshore workers and eventually joining the Communist Party. Photojournalist David Bacon wrote of Brother Robinson, quote, "One of the things I learned about Leo was that he was not afraid of being called a Red. He took great pride in it. When someone insults you and call you a Red," he said, "that's when you know you're doing good work. When you're really hurting the racists, that's their weapon of choice, to call you a Red." With radical leaders on the docks, both black and white, Leo's emergence as a rank-and-file leader began to emerge in the early 1970s. He became an active rank-and-file member, vigilantly protecting workers' rights, union democracy, and worker contracts. He was repeatedly elected to the local's executive board and the union's key decision-making body, the Longshore Caucus. It's important to mention that ILWU is the only predominantly African-American longshore local on the West Coast. It is also the most radical of all longshore locals in the ILWU. In the 1970s and 80s, Leo's leadership exercised the power of the rank and file and the U.S. working class on the side of South African liberation struggle and against the racist apartheid regime. In 1976, after the Soweto uprising and youth were massacred, Leo introduced a resolution to Local 10 for a boycott of goods to and from South Africa. Leo assisted in forming Local 10's South Africa Liberation Support Committee, the first anti-apartheid group in American labor union. In April 1976, it put that resolution into action. A 5,000-person strong community picket was honored by ILWU Local 10 members, stalling African cargo at San Francisco's Pier 27 for 2 days at a time when then in prison Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress was slandered as terrorists by the government, U.S. government. He was appointed by Local 10 to speak at rallies regarding anti-apartheid and the South African liberation movement. Along with the Coalition of Black Trade Unions and other community organizations, he organized the first union conference on apartheid at San Francisco State College, my alma mater, by the way, and brought high officials from the African National Congress to San Francisco. ILWU sponsored media events to bring the ANC and South African trade unionists involved in the liberation movement to the West Coast and beyond to speak on their struggles. They did such things as organize nightly meetings, radio interviews, travel to other cities, raise funds, and work with coalition to raise money to build a clinic in Mozambique. The Southern African Liberation Support Committee was successful in securing containers from longshore employers and collected tons of food and medical supplies for freedom fighters in Mozambique, South Africa, and in Zimbabwe. The most impressive action of Local 10 occurred in 1984, when they initiated the longest boycott of South African cargo in U.S. history when the Ned Lloyd Kimberley docked in San Francisco, as Peter explained earlier. That took place at Pier 80. They refused to touch South African cargo, though they unloaded the rest of the ship's contents. So they didn't just boycott the ship. They worked of the vessels, worked of the contents of the ship. And Leo Robinson was quoted on one of the local television saying that we have no quarrel with the people from Australia. We work their cargo, but we did not work the cargo in South Africa. That was in order to make the point and to pinpoint exactly what the struggle was all about. And on the 11th day, what happened was that pressure from the employers and the federal injunction that threatened massive fines on the union and leaders like Leo Robinson and others, this revolutionary courageous act came to an end immediately. But it energized the Bay Area anti-apartheid movement, including students at the nearby University of California, and sparked a movement that spread throughout the West Coast and played a big part in the anti-apartheid actions throughout the country. It's important to remember that the boycotting of the ships, there was also the issue of divesting from any company that did business with South Africa. And also the issue of sanctions. And I think it's important for us to underscore this for this reason. Boycott, sanction, divestment. Isn't that what we're talking about right now with respect to Israel? It worked there, didn't it? And it can work again. It worked with South Africa, and it can work again. So, it's important to also understand that an individual who was responsible for introducing legislation regarding sanctions against South Africa was a congressman by the name of Ronald D. Dellums. And I'm mentioning his name because Ron D. Dellums was a classmate of Leo Robinson at Oakland Technical High School, my alma mater as well. Now, it may be a coincidence that Leo, Ron Dellums, and myself all went to Oakland Technical High School. But we all had fathers who were members of ILWU Local 10. And I think that that's part of the reason that I'm standing here before you today. Leo and his wife, Johnny Pearl Robinson, opened their home to South African freedom fighters who were living underground in the U.S. They provided financial support to some attending universities in the state. During this period, Leo, along with Sister Geraldine Johnson and several others, were founding members of the Northern California chapter of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, otherwise known as CBTU. It was the most radical of all chapters in the country. Leo stated, quote, "Sister Geraldine Johnson, my mentor, my sister, and my teacher, was one of the most dynamic women I ever laid eyes on. When Geraldine gave you your marching orders, you didn't deviate. You didn't equivocate. You just did it, even if you didn't know how." CBTU was one of the key coalition groups in the Bay Area and the anti-apartheid movement. It initiated broader support for the struggle within the ranks of black labor. And it was already mentioned that Nelson Mandela spoke at the Oakland Coliseum, which is where I was born and raised, and he acknowledged the ILWU Local 10 specifically. During the early 1980s, Leo, along with David Stewart and other local members of the CBTU, brought a resolution passed at its convention, calling for international unions to include in their union contracts making Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. a paid holiday. Local 10 adopted it as a contract caucus demand for the Longshore Caucus. The Longshore Division gained Dr. King's birthday as a paid holiday. Leo was a strong believer in rank and filers belonging to working class organizations outside of their local for the purpose of building coalition movements and solidarity. Leo was indeed an internationalist. He and others believed that black people would not be free in the United States if they were not free in South Africa. They were determined to end support given by the U.S. government that kept the apartheid regime alive. Leo knew that workers from both countries had the potential to bring down apartheid. If a longshoreman in San Francisco could find a way to support black workers in South Africa, it would help the liberation movement there survive, win, and change the conditions for black workers here at home. Leo was a tremendous speaker. He possessed a commanding presence and voice. When he spoke, he had the full attention of every member of Local 10's cavernous Union Hall. When he was once asked, "What did the anti-apartheid struggle have to do with the American workers here at home, Leo?" he responded by explaining that while plants are being shut down here, corporations are investing in industry in South Africa, taking advantage of the subjugation of black workers under apartheid. He further highlighted how cargo discharged from the boycotted ship Lloyd Kimberley contained steel, glass, apple juice concentrate, products that all were once produced here in the United States. Leo had a way with words to hammer home a point. Here are some that come to mind. We have permanent interests, not permanent friends. If you don't know your rights, you don't have any. And when it came to dealing with people who he thought were enemies of the working class, he said, quote, "They were not worth 2 dead flies on a syrup bucket." He also said rank and file members should introduce resolutions that say if workers take a pay cut in wages, that the leadership should take a cut in their wages as well. He also said the power of the rank and file resides in his back pocket, referring to his wallet. That was a quote from Harry Bridges. Leo also said, only in unity is there strength. You will either organize or you will starve. It is as simple as that. Leo was a guy that was close to the membership. They would come to him and express their concerns about matters on the job and in the community. They knew he could facilitate discussion on these issues at the executive board of the union meetings. Members trusted his judgment because he believed in what was right as opposed to who was right. He was excellent at dominoes. Yeah, I know about that. He played dominoes in the hall on occasions before dispatch. He was also effective in getting members who may not have agreed with his politics to support efforts that he initiated, such as volunteering to stuff and load containers with humanitarian supplies for freedom fighters in Southern Africa. He was cited for heroism when he and two other longshore workers rescued a fellow worker from sinking in tons of raw sugar. We handle sugar, and the sugar could be like an avalanche and kill him. He saved the brother's life. One day while he was listening to a progressive radio station, he heard about, no, let me back up, that's later. When a longshore brother and his family were being attacked by the KKK in Contra Costa County, this is not in the South, this is in the Bay Area in the 1980s. Leo and others organized the ILW Civil Rights Committee, which included interfaith, labor, and community forces. Longshore workers provided security for the brother and his family, which meant that they were armed to the teeth to protect him until such time as they hired a security firm to protect that brother. One day while listening to a progressive radio station, he heard two black women being interviewed about being harassed by the KKK and other racists in Oroville, California. Leo invited them to speak at the membership meeting. Rank and filers wanted to give support to their plight. He wrote a resolution to have the next membership meeting in Oroville. A stop work meeting was organized with, by the way, the employers included. On the morning of the meeting, members loaded buses and cars in the city, marched through the main thoroughfare of the town to deliver a message to the police chief. Their message was to stop the harassment, cross-burning, graffiti, etc. of the single mothers, or they would be coming back. Leo wrote the ILW position on the Israeli-Palestinian question, calling for the recognition of the Palestine Liberation Organization as the sole representative of the Palestinian people. Okay, they say my time is up. Let me just conclude with this. Today, there was an announcement at ILWU Local 10 that there would be no jobs dispatched today. Because it was announced a few days ago that the Arab Resources and Organizing Center was going to have a demonstration. So the employers, to not seem to be conceding to not working the vessel because of the protesters, decided it was not going to dispatch any jobs. The tradition of Leo Robinson continues today. And I will close with this. Leo always said that if we don't record our history and document it, it never happened, which led me to become a writer and publisher. And I have two books that are here today, and my lovely wife in the back will accommodate you. One book is called Mobilizing in Our Own Name, the Million Worker March, which Leo Robinson was a major player in organizing. The other book is Cleophas Williams, My Life Story in ILWU Local 10. I would suggest that many of you take advantage of these books. They're very reasonable, and you're looking at the publisher along with my wife, Dolores. Thank you for your time.